You're listening to Bloomberg Businessweek with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Hey, Carol, you remember Y2K, right?
Really, really well.
You were actually working here at Bloomberg.
Yeah, I think I just started. And one of the things that we were thinking about big time was what happens when we go from 1999 to 2000. And apparently that can be somewhat difficult, sophisticated, complicated when it comes to technology and computing devices. Like, what does that mean, right? You go from a year that you specified, right, with 2 digits to all of a sudden you really needed all 4.
Yeah, so
can I just tell you that we were, all of us in the news team, we went home, we were given walkie-talkies and everything because we thought in case the phones don't work, and we had to be ready for when in, I guess, Asia or whenever it struck 2000 around the globe first for like the world to come undone. And I got to say, I remember, like we're waiting, nothing happened.
Nothing happened. Well, a new HBO documentary takes us back to that time. It's called Time Bomb Y2K.
Y2K. What does it mean?
Using 2 digits rather than 4 made good economic sense.
But when workers advance clocks to the year 2000,
The world could melt down. Our systems are broken.
We've got a problem with a couple of digits.
This has to be solved.
All right, that was a clip just from Time Bomb Y2K, new documentary on HBO taking us back to the years ahead of Y2K and all the chaos and prepping and fears about power grids failing, nuclear arsenals being at risk, planes falling out of the sky. People were very worried, Carol. Well, Brian Becker and Marley McDonald are the documentary filmmakers and producers behind Time Bomb Y2K. They join us on Zoom from New York. Good to have you both with us this afternoon. Brian, I want to start with you. Why make a documentary about Y2K 24 years later?
So when Marley and I first thought of this idea and started looking into it, it was the summer of 2020. And the first images you see when you Google back Y2K are shots of empty grocery store shelves and people checking out pallets of water and toilet paper at the supermarket and people in line at the gun store. And those images felt awfully familiar to us, as given the reality we were living through in the depths of the pandemic. We knew there was a countdown. We knew from our research that there was extensive footage and media coverage of the event. And kind of living in that moment of the pandemic made us realize that it wasn't just a countdown. It wasn't just something that we lived through and then had mostly forgotten about. It also had, we thought, lessons for our present moment.
Well, I got to say, Marley, I just remember doing interviews, leading up to it, and every conversation, certainly if it was even just a general marketing interview, it was like, okay, so how are you guys planning for Y2K and concerns that, if things come undone and, we can't track investments or markets don't, work properly. Having said that, when you and Brian went to pitch this, were people like, wait, what was Y2K? Because it's a long time ago.
Definitely. Well, everyone who lived through it remembers it, which definitely worked in our favor when pitching this around and was a really special part of making this project. When you tell someone you're working on a movie about Y2K, everyone has to tell you what they were doing New Year's Eve, 1999.
Well, can I just tell you, one of my producers, I think, was in kindergarten. So that kind of like hit home. Anyway, continue, please.
Yeah, Brian and I became historians of what everyone was doing on New Year's Eve, 1999. But when we first started looking into the project, the first question that comes up is, was this a joke or was this real? And, a lot of people remember Y2K as a hoax. And it took us months of research to come to the conclusion that it was a very real problem that was solved. And we did that by talking to a lot of computer programmers and talking to a lot of people who actually worked on the issue. And so we knew we could kind of reclaim this narrative in this movie and shine a light on all the work and labor that went into actually fixing this very real problem.
Marley, can you talk about the style here? I enjoyed the film, but I was surprised to see the way that the documentary was structured, in the sense that there's no narrator and it's nobody looking back or remembering or there are no recollections. It's purely based on archival footage, on videos that were sold at the time, news reports, home videos. Talk a little bit about building it in that sense.
Yeah, so we knew we wanted to do it all archival from the jump because one, there was just enough footage. There was a lot of footage. And when we first started working with the material, we realized that, everything was sort of there, and that if we kept it in the world of all archival, we could really kind of make this countdown feel more present tense, feel like a time capsule of that actual moment. And Brian is an archival producer and found, along with our team, all of that footage. We ended up with over 700 hours of footage. And as far as the structure of the film goes, we knew that we wanted to sort of replicate the way that Y2K worked in the world. So starting with the technical problem, watching it sort of radiate out of cubicles and into the social consciousness, and then follow that to sort of the fringes of America. And we knew we had to get to midnight at some point.
As you went through the footage and you guys were gathering it, Brian, I mean, what was it that kind of jumped out? Was there certain things that were like, oh my God, like it was just kind of interesting? Because there was real nervousness about how this might play out.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain attraction always to footage that is kind of unbelievable to watch in the present, whether it be, a tape made by a militia titled Y2K, why should I care? I don't even own a computer. But I think what we really started looking for, most specifically in the footage, were moments that could clearly tether us from present to past. Because we didn't include interviews with individuals in the present day, we were looking for kind of moments of emotion or introspection or relevance between then and now. But of course, when Matt Damon is recorded speaking about the nuclear arsenal and his fear of the nuclear arsenal potentially shutting down, you kind of have to also include things like that in your movie.
A very young Matt Damon promoting at the time the talented Mr. Ripley, I should note. Hey, Brian, have you heard from any of these folks who were featured in this?
Yes, thanks for asking that. We actually have relationships with all of the individuals who we built scenes around in this film. It didn't feel fair for us to include their historic likenesses in our feature without talking to them first to gauge what Y2K meant to them. So, for example, Peter de Jager, who is one of the first individuals who kind of brought Y2K to the public's attention, I spent 2 days in his basement with him outside of Toronto. He just published a new book focused on computer management, and we just appeared on Peter's podcast about Y2K, which I can plug here. Candace Turner, who in the film calls herself Farmer Jane, I emailed with Candace this morning, and I went to her farm in Sarcoxie, Missouri. She moved there, she lived there in advance in the lead up to Y2K, and she still lives on that very same farm. I went to her mudroom and came back to New York with some VHS tapes of hers.
Yeah.
Toscanins in DC. So we do have relationships with these people.
I want to get back to Brian Becker and Marley McDonald. They are the documentary filmmakers and producers behind the new HBO documentary, Time Bomb Y2K. They join us on Zoom from New York.
It's interesting, Brian and Marley, that it's been a week where Tim and I have been talking a lot about the risks in 2024. We certainly did at the end of last year and into the new year, but this week, some of the concerns were big time the November elections and basically the U.S. against itself. Geopolitics certainly came up, and it made Tim and I think about how your documentary kind of ends up. We're essentially just before midnight in the U.S., December 31st, 1999. You have Boris Yeltsin, right, conceding power to Vladimir Putin, who would take over to lead what was then, the Soviet Union, right?
No, the Soviet Union had broken up. It was just Russia.
Yeah,
and there's this ominous sort of moment from the newscaster that says, Putin wants this to be a a strong Russia, but has no ambitions beyond, like for expansion and to get bigger.
Here we are 24 years later, and we know that that's very different. But I do wonder how you guys are thinking about, having gone through this process, about some of the risks and the concerns that are out there today. And coming off a global pandemic that really made us all realize, whoa, our life can change dramatically and our lives are at risk.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. So our movie actually premiered at a festival last March, and during the Q&As at that time, a lot of the questions were relating our film to COVID. Then sometime over the summer, the questions started to become about the threat of AI. And so it's interesting to kind of see how this movie moves through the world as it continues, going through different existential threats. And that's, I think, what we wanted to do with this film, is really examine the ways in which America faces existential threats and kind of the focus on how interconnected and dependent we are on each other, and really highlighting that aspect of getting through things like Y2K or COVID.
Every time I think that we collectively go through an experience that will somehow bring us closer together as citizens, I turn out to be wrong. I felt this way during COVID, that sort of like everybody was in this together and it would be this uniting force. And I look at the landscape right now, Brian, and I think that we've never been more divided ever than we have been right now.
Yeah, I mean, I feel the same too, Tim. Y2K almost feels like this dry run in which we actually did succeed in solving a problem, and then, of course, in very American fashion, quickly dismissed it as a joke or as a hoax after we went through it. It almost feels as if we worked on it so well and solved it to an extent that we would have learned more if more things went wrong after the clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve 1999. Instead, we kind of missed this opportunity to think so much about how our lives had come to depend upon technology and also on each other to an extent.
It's kind of interesting on a day where, safe to say, we all got fooled about the approval by the SEC of a spot Bitcoin ETF. Where a headline crossed on Twitter from the official SEC account, and then 10 minutes later, the chair of the SEC comes out and said, no, that's not correct. They have not received approval, and that the SEC Twitter account was compromised. You just realize how quickly and how vulnerable we are and reliant on technology, and how things can be misconstrued, got wrong. And you just, I don't know, when you start to extrapolate that, you just wonder kind of, Tim, where we could go with this.
Yeah, it also, it was so interesting to see that the way technology has shifted. And, it's been a quarter century roughly since this time period, but the technology shifts that we've seen have been absolutely massive.
Yeah.
Marley, it
and
also,
our reliance, I feel like,
reliance
on technology.
There's this picture.
So.
There's a picture painted, Marley, in the 1990s about the optimism about technology. And I'm wondering if you think that the optimism that these folks in the 90s talked about and alluded to, about school children being able to access information at any time, has actually manifested in something that looks optimistic or looks, scary. I mean, there's talk about parents being concerned about TikTok, mental health and social media, government control of this stuff. I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Certainly, I'm very concerned with the state of our relationship to technology. And I think that was something that we really wanted to sort of capture, that techno-optimism of the 90s in our film. This was the first time that people were really welcoming computers into their lives. It was at their office or in their home for the first time. But I think what Y2K revealed is just how dependent we actually already were on computer systems that we weren't seeing, to get on the train, or how we get the news in the morning. Like, everything had already been kind of operated by these giant systems, but we hadn't come face to face with that. So I think Y2K was an interesting moment for kind of deconstructing our reliance on technology. But yeah, as far as where we've come today, we've only gone deeper in that hole. And like Brian says, it could have been a moment where we had pivoted and maybe taken a different route. But because we did get in front of the problem and solve it, we've just gone further and further down this road. And if something like this were to happen today, the same questions would arise.
Hey, we only have about 30 seconds left, Brian, but I want to give you the last word. What's the next thing you guys are working on?
I'm working on a film about the rise and fall of the American enclosed shopping mall. And Marley, I'll pass it to you to describe what you're working on.
I'm developing a film based on the archives at the Museum of Natural History and the origins of natural history museums.
All right,
Very cool. Big thank you to both of you for joining us. Everybody check out the new film. It's on HBO. It is all about Y2K. It's called Time Bomb Y2K. A big thank you to our guests, Brian Becker and Marley McDonald, the documentary filmmakers and producers behind Time Bomb.